Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will talk about rainforests with guests Suzanne Pelletier, Executive Director of the Rainforest Foundation US, and Ginger Cassady, Executive Director of the Rainforest Action Network. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we would take 3 snap polls during the show. We'll announce results, and questions submitted to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you both for joining us. I'm so happy to be talking about the rainforests. You know, we see images, rather disturbing images of deforestation in the rainforests, some of the most lush environments that we have on this planet. But I'd like to start off really talking about rainforests and the extent of rainforests, because we tend to associate rainforests with one area. We tend to associate rainforests with the Amazon. We also tend to associate rainforests with one type of climate and one type of vegetation, one type of geography. But that's not really what rainforests are on this planet Earth. Ginger, could you start us off with just sort of an overview of what a rainforest is and where they are located?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having us. Yeah, rainforests are some of the most biologically diverse ecosystems in the world. And when I talk about, there's different types of rainforests. There's coastal temperate rainforests when we look at the Pacific Northwest, and then there's tropical rainforests. When you talk about the Amazon, it's in the southern hemisphere of the Earth. And I like to say our tropical rainforests kind of hug the lower part of the Earth. And, they're one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems that are really critical to not only stabilizing our climate, but also providing the oxygen that we breathe every single day. And one thing about tropical rainforests is they're some of the most biologically diverse ecosystems that not only provide homes for thousands of plant and animal species, they're also home to thousands of indigenous communities that really rely on these ecosystems for their livelihoods. So tropical rainforests and just rainforests around the world are really critical, for not only stabilizing our climate, but supporting our everyday lives. So it's, why Suzanne and I do the work that we do, is protecting these really critical ecosystems, especially when we're facing one of the biggest crises of our time, climate change.
So tropical rainforests are one type of rainforest, but they're also temperate rainforests, right, Suzanne?
Yes. And, one of the things that defines a rainforest is a lot of rain. So when you think about, the forests in the temperate areas, the Pacific Northwest, Americans are familiar with, there's forests that have a lot of rain. Like in the tropics, it's over 100 inches of rain a year. So there are forests in the United States, in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. So in that northern belt, Ginger talked about that belt around the middle in the tropics. There's also, rainforests that are in northern climates as well, that are in temperate areas.
And talk a little bit about the cycle that engenders the rain, because one of the things that we need to really come to grips with is that cycle that creates the rain, and that environment that creates the home for various species, flora and fauna. That cycle can be broken by human beings.
Right. Yeah. One thing about tropical forests, like in the Amazon, over half of the rain that falls in the Amazon is produced by the trees in the Amazon. So this is where there's this link, Mark, you're talking about. The trees have an important role, and deforestation, this is where it comes in with when trees are cut down. That cycle of what's transpiration, that they lift the water from underground, lift it up through the canopy, it goes up into the atmosphere and then comes down as rain. That cycle, like I said, over 50 to 80% of the entire water cycle in the Amazon comes from the trees that are produced, which has an enormous effect on both the biodiversity, the plants and animals that live in the system, as well as globally. 15% of all of the fresh water in the world is from the Amazon rainforest and is dispelled into the ocean. As that cycle gets broken, Less trees, if you have less trees, you have less water going up into the air, which then creates a drier environment for the trees that are living there, which means that they're more prone to possibly die because they don't have enough water, which then reinforces that cycle. And there's something that scientists have come to realize recently, something called aerial rivers. So that water that gets brought up into the atmosphere, it actually creates this system of they call it aerial rivers, because there's actually more moisture in the air that gets brought up from the trees than actually is in the Amazon River. And those cycles, it's not just in the area that is defined by the Amazon basin. It's not just there that these water cycles affect. It affects global climate and global weather patterns. So in the United States, if we lose the Amazon, we lose rainfall in the West and South and Midwest of the United States.
In part, Ginger, I envision this as if there are concentric circles in the air over these forests. And the concentric circles go from the very center of that circle, where there is the highest humidity, right, all the way out to the edges of the forest where there is the lowest humidity, because that part of the air is being affected by non-forested areas, right? And you need to have the largest, greenest part of that circle survive in order to have the healthiest forest. And as we cut down trees, we're basically creating deserts in the air. And those deserts in the air can no longer nourish those areas on the ground. So there is a interaction. And then, of course, you have the connection between those, if you think of them as almost domed systems, right? Those domed systems are not divided from everything else. As Suzanne said, right? The water gets supplied into the oceans. It affects coastal species development, and so on. So it really does radiate out. How do we fix this system where the incentives that we have, the economic incentives of human beings, are tilted toward the cutting and the exploitation and the destruction of these systems, as opposed to building them up and preserving them?
Absolutely. I mean, tropical forests are so critical. Forests around the world are critical with stabilizing the climate, and they provide these kind of natural services that are critical, not just in the Amazon, but also other big tropical forest regions like in the Congo Basin of Africa, and also Southeast Asia and Indonesia, which are the three largest tropical forest regions in the world. And when we create unstable, when there's instability in the ecosystem, and you start to see deforestation rates, you start to see significant drought and things that are impacting other parts of the world. And so that's why it's so critical to really look at what are the key drivers of deforestation. And I think one of the things that we really focus at our organization are who are the biggest financial institutions that are behind driving deforestation infrastructure, and who are the biggest brands that are out there, biggest, corporations in the commodity sector that are also driving deforestation. And when you look at it, you really have to really follow the money and figure out how do we slow down deforestation rates, because they are one of the most important solutions when we talk about climate stability. And so for us, we really focus in on those areas, and really focusing on governments. Right now, governments have a lot of responsibility on putting forward greater protections. And unfortunately, we're seeing deforestation rates going up, especially in this time of COVID, where a lot of countries like Brazil are trying to stabilize their economy. You're seeing deforestation rates go up because they're really relaxing a lot of environmental regulation, which right now is more critical than ever when we talk about how to think about solutions when looking at the situation we're currently in, with the alarming rates of deforestation that are happening all around the world, particularly in tropical forest regions.
Well, it seems that we have to shift how we view extractive industries. Whether it's trees or whether it's oil, it seems that we socialize the downside elements of these extractive industries, and we privatize the upside exploitation of those industries. So how do we get to the point where the full social cost is included at the point of harvest, whether it's oil or whether it's minerals, or whether it's, and you see this with mining in Appalachia, or harvesting of trees? How do we do this? And Could you talk a little bit about how your organizations deal with the economics as well as the conservation elements here? Because you have people who live in these forests who are being displaced through this activity. Suzanne, why don't you give it a cut first, and then we'll go to Ginger.
Sure. Just to add on to what Ginger was talking about with companies, something that we don't consider very often is that, about 70% of South America's GDP is dependent on products from the Amazon.
Right.
So, and you're absolutely right.
70%, you said.
Yes. Yeah.
70%. And once that's gone, what do?
I don't know. Yeah.
It can
So,
only be spent once.
Yeah. You're absolutely right that we have to get to a point where these costs are incorporated and to where we're valuing a standing forest more than we're valuing, the products of when it's cut. I mean, so many studies have been done about the actual value of a hectare forest and, how much money you can get from just clearing the trees, how much, money you can get from cattle. I mean, and it's something like 10 times more valuable to just have the forest standing because of the ecosystem services that area is providing. And, as we've just been talking about deforestation, as there is less and less forest, those values hopefully should be valued higher and higher. One thing that we do as an organization is, we work directly with the indigenous communities who are living in the forest that are protecting the forest. And, from what we see, we focus a lot on land rights for indigenous people because the data shows that where indigenous peoples control about a quarter of the Amazon. And in the area where they control, deforestation rates are about a third of what they are on other lands. So working on helping indigenous communities to get their land rights is a really cost-effective solution to promote and protect forests and stop deforestation. So that's
one of the things that it seems to me is that the environmental movement has really been very short-sighted for a very long time. The environmental movement, particularly in the United States, has been largely white folks who look at the environment, and from their position of relative wealth, they basically say, this needs to be preserved, right? Comes out of the science, comes out of a heartfelt conviction. This whole issue of providing voice to indigenous peoples was really an afterthought. And the whole idea of the economics and giving some validity to the economic concerns of people who have to make a living today, it's kind of an afterthought. I think we're kind of growing up, aren't we, as a sector? And we are trying to adjust our own modes of operating, thinking, staffing, boards, interacting with people locally. Ginger, how has that affected you as you've looked at your operations, you've tried to adjust? It's been quite a humbling experience that all this effort has not had the results that you anticipated. You're changing the way you're operating now, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think everyone is. It's going back on Suzanne's point, it's like at the end of the day, we need to acknowledge the kind of, the colonialistic mindset that's, been put forward to create a lot of the land management that's now managing our forests, all around the world. And if we don't, give the land rights back to the indigenous communities that are, that have been there for, hundreds of years, that's really, really key and critical. And that's something that when we're dealing with corporations, I mean, free, prior, informed consent is one of the key things when looking at how lands should be managed, and indigenous and frontline communities are actually the best stewards of land. And you see a lot lower levels of deforestation happening in key regions. But when you look at, a lot of the infrastructure that's been created, a lot of those costs are not, put into the equation, especially with a lot of the big corporations. And an example that I'll talk about is like the palm oil expansion in Indonesia, where for decades, the real cost of palm oil expansion has not been included as far as the labor costs that goes into, exploiting, the area, to the land costs and things like that. And so one of the things that RAN is really focused on is centering really customary land rights and first acknowledging whose land people are operating in, how governments can shift their patterns, and also demanding that, those land rights are acknowledged, and really acknowledging not just the environmental costs, but the human rights costs when you're talking about, a broader ecosystem and the impact that's happening in that region. As far as RAN organizationally, we're doing a lot of work looking at, systems of oppression and ways that we can really change our practices, and really trying to diversify our approach, but at the same time, making sure we're really, empowering and supporting groups on the front line, and really shifting a lot of resources and energy into areas where it's most needed, because I think that really hasn't been acknowledged for many years. When looking within the environmental movement, we really need to center the communities that are most impacted, and hand the mic, as I love folks say, to folks that are really dealing with the impact overall. So that's a really important issue that we all need to be addressing, and it is critical, not just in the nonprofit sector, but across every single sector.
Are you shifting board membership and staff membership to reflect those values?
Absolutely. We have more representation of folks in regions that we're working in, especially in particular. A lot of our focus is in Indonesia, because palm oil has become such a big, significant driver of deforestation, as well as making sure we have staff in those regions that can speak to the issues at hand. That's really, really important.
If I could add, Mark, I thank you for bringing up that issue about traditional conservation. And I think there's been a lot of awareness in the last 5 years or so amongst conservation organizations. There's been a lot of talk. And if you look at the language that the big conservation groups are using, it's people focused. There's a lot of discussion about Indigenous peoples, but there's a lot to make up for. There's been over 100 million people have been displaced around the world because of conservation over the years, 100 million people. And so I'm hopeful that there's a lot more discussion and language about it. But we do have a long way to go. Because Indigenous people, they cover, their territories are 65% of the earth. They're, more than half of the earth is under Indigenous collective management, and they only have rights to 10%. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for this mindset to change, and then for us to really put our policies into place that reflect that data.
One of the things that strikes me is that we get involved in this specious argument about the opposition, whoever we are. Right? If we're right-leaning, left-leaning, or in indigo, whoever we are, is the opposition is getting a handout or getting government support or whatever it is. What's really happening is that we're all struggling for our interests, and we don't necessarily listen to the interests of others enough. We just took a poll, and two of the polls are really interesting. The third one's coming up. The first poll was, what is the most important driver in efforts to preserve rainforests? One is rich in biodiversity. That rainforests sequester carbon and slow climate change got the most votes, 71%. And Indigenous people live in rainforests and their land rights should be respected. That was 18%. So we have those three different elements. But really, when it comes right down to it, the marketing of carbon to create that sense, that's being highly successful. But really the answer is all of the above, right? It's biodiversity, it's carbon sequestration, it's respect for fellow human beings. And then we asked the second poll, which was really interesting. I'm sorry, we skipped over the second, we somehow got to the third. The third poll was, how do we ensure the human rights and interests of Indigenous peoples? Okay, and then we asked a set of scaled questions, first giving Indigenous people sort of ownership rights, right? They decide, it's their land. The second piece is that they should have a seat at the table, and the third, that experts should evaluate. 67% felt that at least a seat at the table, and 27% actually felt that there were ownership rights, that Indigenous people actually decide on how the land is used. How do you see the dynamic shaping out so that we can respect the different interests here in a way that really focuses on human values and is sustainable. Suzanne, you want to give a start to this one?
Well, I think it's going to, I mean, I think we've moved in that direction, and it's going to be very uncomfortable for governments. I mean, Indigenous people are more, I mean, just within the past, 5 years or so, are they actually have more of a voice at international conventions and meetings. They still don't have the same say that member states have, but there's, it's moving in a certain direction. I think you're right about climate change. Is all of a sudden there's renewed attention on forests and the stewards of those forests. It's the issue that in my career, it has brought up this issue. It's raised awareness more than anything else. And so, I think just the more and more that we embrace the facts and you look at that data, I know data doesn't necessarily move hearts, but I would hope that, now we're entering a period of more fact-based policy development, and that we see that if we are going to stop the climate crisis, we have to stop deforestation. And the only way to do it cost effectively is to support the Indigenous people that are managing those forests and make sure that they get the support they need, that money for forest protection does not stay at the international and national, in the capital of the countries where the deforestation is happening.
Ginger, how do you balance the interests that are local in country versus the global interests? Because there is certainly a global interest in preserving rainforests, but you also can't have international institutions run roughshod over countries like Brazil. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's definitely complicated, but it's critical that Indigenous communities and people on the front lines are at the decision-making table, and that we create and demand that space is always there. And I think that that's why international corporations and financial institutions who have really focused interests in these other regions, that they acknowledge, one, the customary land rights of communities on the front lines, and as well as are open to making sure they're at the table when making decisions around the way that they're investing, the way they're doing business, that there's some type of consultation that goes along with the process. And that is so critical. And at the same time, if those steps aren't happening, be willing to pull their business out of those areas that have a large risk, not only to the communities on the ground, but also reputation and financial risks to the companies. And I think we've seen that in Brazil, we see that in Southeast Asia. And so that's kind of where our organization really demands and pushbacks on corporations that are not centering the human rights and environmental costs at the forefront when going into these type of practices, and really trying to expose them and put the spotlight on those kind of bad actors that are out there. And that's really what goes into a large kind of markets campaign, to really apply that pressure, making sure that those voices on the ground are really heard and that they are part of the decision-making process.
So that's a really interesting point. So it's not just the business side, it's not just the right side, it's also human perceptions, right? It's trying to encourage our neighbors who might be investors to not invest in activities that are detrimental to the planet. It's trying to encourage ourselves to not buy wood products that might come from places that are the result of deforestation. Right? It's the little things, and we have to change our behaviors. We have to change our attitudes, right?
Absolutely. It's trying to, right now looking at the supply chains and trying to get, not only the financial institutions, but large, commodity traders to commit to zero deforestation in their business model. There's a lot of policies out there that, companies have made, but at the same time, there's also got to be the government regulatory, initiatives that are taking place as well. So I think there is just a lot more opportunity, as Suzanne was, stating. There's more of these dialogues happening in bigger global forums, but there's got to be the will of the countries, and that's why it's so important when you have these governments that get in control who completely don't even acknowledge the rights of Indigenous communities, where you see this major shift in deforestation rates going up in places like Indonesia because of Bolsonaro and his regime. So it's really not only demanding that governments shift, but it's also getting corporations to shift who they're doing business with. And if they're not aligned with the, those kind of zero deforestation initiatives, then really changing their business, and which what we're really focusing on right now through our, our markets work.
Bolsonaro is Brazil, you meant?
Absolutely, yeah. Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, who under his, presidency, you've seen deforestation rates really go through the roof because he completely does not acknowledge indigenous, land rights. He's a very racist president and has a very top-down approach. And so I think that he kind of has that old school, way of looking at things. And that's something that we just have to really shift and demand that companies and banks don't do business with him as long as, he's really exploiting not only the people, but the resources in the Brazilian Amazon.
In terms of your program, Suzanne, could you just talk a little bit about some of the most important programs that you are implementing to create change and to preserve? Because, while we're talking, trees are being cut down, right? Deforestation is progressing. We haven't really slowed the pace. And as a matter of fact, given the fact that these rainforests are shrinking, in proportion to the size of the rainforests, we seem to be seeing an acceleration. Talk about the most important investments that you're making to change that dynamic.
Okay. Two things. One that we've done since day one as an organization for over 30 years is focus on helping communities get their land rights. So that's just, as we've been talking, because we know it works, we have an expertise in it. So we're working with communities in several different countries across the Amazon to push for their rights where there's still claims that are outstanding. And then the second thing that we've been, what we're doing a lot more now, and we see more, a lot of the future of what we do is community-based monitoring of forest destruction, because so much illegal activity, so much deforestation is illegal. The vast majority of deforestation in the Amazon is illegal. And a lot of that just goes unseen. And so and it happens in indigenous or near indigenous communities. So what we're doing is empowering, training indigenous technicians and local community members to monitor what's happening on the ground, monitor the deforestation. There's a lot of new technological tools now with remote sensing data and deforestation alerts and smartphones that are cheap and easy to use. And so we've developed a system where in local communities to monitor what they're doing and integrate that into what they know works, their traditional monitoring system, their traditional governance system. So by integrating those two things, we've found that they can decrease deforestation even more. So that's a big push for what we're doing as an organization to scale that across the Amazon.
Ginger, is it possible to, in any way, reforest areas?
Yeah, it's not, there's definitely, rainforests are very resilient. They can bounce back. There's a lot of areas that we've worked in Southeast Asia where they've, pulled out, illegal palm oil plantations, and the forest has, come back, after a few years. But it's, we don't, keeping forests standing is the best solution instead of just going in and creating a monoculture, just replanting trees. So yeah, I think that's the top goal, is to keep the original intact forest there. But yeah, tree planting and stuff, is, I think, good in urban areas. But as far as replacing a tropical rainforest, once you impact that ecosystem, you can't really return to its original state, but it is pretty resilient. So that's why, I think both our organizations are so focused on keeping those original forests intact, and keeping forests standing is the number one, most important solution.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to that, Ginger, that we also, focusing on forest protection, that, but knowing that because we've reached a crisis point across the world, that we do have to replant as well. And, whether that's our organizations that are going to be doing that on a massive scale, that's going to actually make a difference, not sure. We are starting to do that with indigenous communities, but we know it has to be part of the solution also. We just lost too much.
Suzanne, I'll let you have the last word. Ginger, Cassady, thank you so much for describing the work of the Rainforest Action Network. So important. And Suzanne Pelletier, Executive Director of the Rainforest Foundation US. Very important work, and it's really important that we all get engaged. On that note, as I said, on Thursday, we're going to be talking about domestic violence. What we're trying to do in these programs is to get Americans engaged in the things that actually affect our daily lives. We all spend a lot of time being entertained by various programs, and the news is all about politics and violence and so on. But there are so many things, whether it's education of children, or our neighbors living in hunger, or homelessness, or environmental conservation, that we all need to get involved in. We figured half an hour twice a week was a great way of sort of sharing information from people whose passion, like you, Suzanne, and like you, Ginger, and your folks and your supporters, whose passions run in particular directions, and we can all benefit from them. That's the nonprofit report. Thank you both for being part of the show, and we'll see you all next Thursday.